Overseer Thresh watched the human step off the intake ramp and promised the whole assembled work block a corpse by dawn. His mandibles clicked the guarantee against his collarbone, the Vrethkai oath of pride, and the translation ring at his throat compressed the sound into 3 blunt human syllables the boiler technician did not even bother to look up at. He had made that promise 216 times. He had never once been wrong. But 9 hours later, when the private guard sergeant crawled onto the command deck with a tungsten carbide burr driven clean through the meat of his knee, Thresh was already zip-tied to his own throne of a chair by a length of stripped conduit, and the human was standing at the observation window watching the noon light rise over a camp that had, in a single work cycle, quietly changed hands. Thresh's command collar had a new setting. The human had programmed it himself in a slow drawl that made the translation ring hum warm against the plates of his neck. It said one word: wait. The air on the intake dock of Extraction Camp Voreth 9 tasted of hot copper, burned ozone, and rendered synthetic grease. 9 hours earlier, that same intake dock was where Overseer Thresh liked to make his speeches. He liked the geometry of it. The pressed alloy floor sloped 7 degrees toward a drainage grate meant to carry away the humours of species that leaked when they were frightened, and the ceiling arched high enough that his ceremonial thorax mantle threw a shadow the length of 2 adult Vrethkai over the intake queue. When he stepped onto the pulpit above the dock, every soul below him had to look up, and looking up, in the Vrethkai courtly grammar, was the same word as admitting. The transport hatch cracked, and the intake process began with the noise of tired hinges, chain drift, boot scrape, the low, obedient dragging of the recently sold. Thresh watched them file. 2 Varian kelp farmers with their gill plates already dried out from the transport atmosphere. 6 Peth Morans, chittering in the low frequencies of grief. A single gal nomad, 3 meters at the shoulder, whose sale value would just about pay for the hour it took to break him, and at the very back, small and pale and inevitable, the human. Thresh consulted his intake manifest. The Vrethkai reader eye at his temple flicked the file open across the inside of his skull. Beckett, Roy, male, 41 Earth years. Point of origin, Harlan County, Kentucky. Species profile, Terran, unmodified. Trade classification, maintenance grade 4, boiler and thermal systems. No combat flag, no tactical clearance, no noted augmentations. Shipping tag, private consignment, purchased in bulk lot with 212 other mining-adjacent humans as a hedge against upcoming ore extraction demand along the outer edge of the conclave. Thresh's mandibles rustled with something close to disappointment. There was no fun in a boiler technician. The intake queue liked a soldier or a scholar or a mother, someone whose fall was a story. A boiler technician was just laundry. Still, he had his script. Hear me. He clicked in the low-court dialect, and the translation ring at his throat and every collar on every neck below him echoed the word in every language the camp had ever held. I am Overseer Thresh. This camp is mine. Its dust is mine. Its heat is mine. Its water is measured by my mercy. Every one of you was sold to me by a hand you loved, or by a system too tired to feed you. That is not my concern. My concern is only this: which of you will break first, and which of you will break slowest? He liked the way his own voice sounded coming out of the collars. He liked the way the small ones flinched. 216 times, he said, I have stood on this dock and pointed at one of you and promised a broken body by dawn. 216 times Dawn has agreed with me. He let a full 3 seconds pass. The intake dock was in dead silence. Even the gal nomad was still. He pointed one long, articulated finger. He pointed at Roy Beckett. By local dawn, 9 hours from now, this one will be on his knees in Section Green asking for his mother in whatever soft language his species uses when the heat has finished with them. I promise it. I promise it to my ancestors. I promise it to the ore market. I promise it, in particular, to him. The intake queue made the small, obedient noises of terror. The boiler technician looked up at Thresh slowly from under the shelf of his brow. His face had the tiredness of a man who had been dragged across 4 star systems in a cargo hold, and the resignation of a man who had, on Earth, spent his working life doing the same things over and over in the same dark. There was no fight in the face, there was no defiance. There was only a slow, thick, patient calm of the sort Thresh had seen exactly twice before and forgotten both times. Roy Beckett's eyes were the color of coal ash. He nodded once at the overseer, the way a man nods when someone has just given him directions to the bathroom. And that was the moment. That, though Thresh would not understand it for many hours yet, was the exact moment the promise began to fail. Thresh's second, a nervous, low-caste courtier called Vesic, whose mandibles were sanded down to indicate rank, waited until the intake queue had been herded off the dock before he lifted his flat carrier eye at his master. "Section grain, overseer?" Vesic asked. "Section grain," Thresh confirmed. "Full thermal cycle, 60% rated heat, floor angled to fatigue, 18 hours to break, standard. He will not last 9. He is soft." "He is dense, overseer," Vesic ventured cautiously. "The scan says his bone density is... he is soft," Thresh repeated, in the tone that meant the conversation was over. "Fetch me my ceremonial water, and send a runner to the accounting annex. Ovarch Vel Sain's inspection tour docks in 4 rotations. I want the manifest polished. I want it to shine." Vesic bowed his mandibles and skittered off. Thresh, alone on his pulpit above the empty intake dock, ran a claw along the underside of his ceremonial mantle and permitted himself the low sub-vocalization Vrethkai called the pride purr. 216 times. 217 come morning. He turned his back on the empty room. He did not see the boiler technician in the corridor below, moving down toward Section Green with the same slow, thick, patient calm, taking careful cataloging note of every conduit run, every access panel, every ventilation grate, every emergency vent, every load-bearing bolt, every unlabeled maintenance access, and every single Vrethkai guard by height, weight, weapon length, weapon reach, and the slight, telling asymmetry each of them favored when they walked. Roy Beckett was not escaping. Roy Beckett was building a map. Section Grain was Overseer Thresh's favorite. Section Grain was where subjects were sent to remember that they were in fact mortal, and Section Grain had never, in the long ledger of Extraction Camp Vorath 9, been wrong about that. The chamber was a sloped alloy tube, 20 meters long, a bore head at the far end, grinding slow ceremonial cycles through a decorative wall of ore-rich rock that was, in truth, not actually mining anything. The bore head existed to make noise and heat. The temperature ran to 60% of rated capacity, well into the range where Vrethkai physiology began to sing with pain and Pethmaran physiology began to weep. The floor's angle forced constant lower body muscle engagement so that even standing still was work. The camp's record suggested that the average captive in Section Grain began to hallucinate at hour 4, wept openly at hour 7, and offered any confession requested by hour 9. The records did not include humans. The pressure door sealed behind Roy Beckett with the soft, wet thump of a Vrethkai vault. Roy stood at the top of the sloped floor, one hand on the wall, and let his eyes get used to the light. It was orange, the sort of orange that meant heat and not sun. There was a faint chemical tang riding on top of the copper. He said, quietly, to no one, "All right." He put down the ration bar the intake had given him, a Vrethkai proteinaceous brick that tasted, he had already decided, like drywall, and he began to walk the room. Not run, not shout, not pace. Walk. 90 seconds down, 90 seconds back, eyes on everything. The bore head at the far end had a mounting bracket at the pivot. Roy stood in front of it and looked at it for the length of time it took to breathe 6 times. The bracket had been designed for Vrethkai grip strength, a wrench arm 3 meters long, meant to be turned by a hand, with 4 fingers of an inch's worth of chitin around the palm. Roy found the wrench in a service hollow beside the bracket. 4 kilograms. He hefted it in one hand and did not adjust his stance. He put the wrench back. Not yet. He walked to the ventilation grate at the low end of the room. He looked at it. He looked at the shaft that ran up from it. He counted 3 baffles in the shaft. He walked to the emergency vent behind the false ore wall. He put his palm to the seam. It was cool, not hot. That meant the vent was pumping out to a section of the camp that did not run at 60% thermal. That meant the vent ran back toward the central atmosphere plant. And the central atmosphere plant, if the camp was built the way every camp was built, was 6 wall thicknesses away from the command deck. He walked back to the top of the sloped floor. He sat down. He ate the ration bar. His hands did not shake. He had been in section grain for 4 minutes and 20 seconds. By hour 1, Roy had used the 4-kilo wrench to lever open the borehead's mounting bracket and dismount the bracket entirely, because the bracket, laid across 2 ceiling ventilation baffles at just the right angle, made an excellent conductive shim. He had used it to short a segment of the interior thermal exhaust rail across a length of stripped conduit, which he had stripped with the flat edge of the wrench and the patient application of his heel. By hour 2, the interior thermal exhaust was no longer pumping heat into section grain. It was pumping heat back into itself in a small, tidy, self-cooling loop. Section grain's temperature had dropped 31 degrees. Roy had spent hour 3 sitting on the floor with his back against the pressure door, eating a second ration bar. Overseer Thresh's monitor relay, which he was in the process of ignoring while he practiced the walking cadence of the courtly greeting he intended to perform for Inspector Ovach Velzane in 4 rotations, chimed once. He waved his mandibles at it. It chimed twice. He turned his head, irritated. What? Vesic was in the doorway, holding a data slate at arm's length. His mandibles were flat against his throat in the Vrethkai posture of extremely reluctant news. Section Gren, Overseer. He is dead already? Thresh asked, mostly to be cruel about it. I said dawn. It has been 3 hours. He is. Vesic hesitated, and then, because there was no polite way to say it, said it. He is sitting on the floor. Section grain is at ambient. The bore head is dismounted. He has rerouted the thermal exhaust. He is eating. Thresh did not, at first, understand the sentence. He stood slowly, his mandibles opened wide, in the Vrethkai posture of interrogation. Say that again. Section grain is at ambient, Overseer. The internal thermometer reads 22 degrees. The bore head is disassembled. The thermal exhaust is running in a self-cooling loop. The human is on the floor. He is eating a ration bar. He is. Thresh's mandibles clicked twice involuntarily. He is doing what? Sitting, Overseer. There was a long silence in the pulpit room. Thresh became aware, in the small, quiet way one becomes aware of a mistake made very early in a long day, that he had never asked what a maintenance grade 4 actually meant. Fetch me the Earth Liaison dossier, he said. Vesic's mandibles went briefly loose with surprise. Earth Liaison dossiers cost money. They cost real, listed, expense-audited money, and the Vrethkai bureaucracy did not release them without paperwork. Overseer, the requisition. Fetch it, Thresh said in the tone that meant the conversation was again over. And send 4 guards to section grain, reset the room, weld the bracket, increase the thermal to 75%, and put the human in restraints. I will speak with him personally at hour 4. Yes, Overseer. Vesic fled. Thresh stood on the empty pulpit and, for the first time in his career as an overseer of Extraction Camp Voreth 9, felt an unfamiliar, prickling sensation along the ventral seam of his thorax. It took him a moment to identify it. It was the beginning of curiosity. The 4 guards Vesic dispatched arrived at the pressure door of Section Grain in a diamond formation, weapons up, in the standard Vrethkai breach posture. Their sergeant, a scarred old veteran named Vake, keyed the door and stepped through with his pulse lance leveled. He found the boiler technician sitting against the far wall, hands loose in his lap, eyes closed. The thermal exhaust was purring in its self-cooling loop. The borehead's bracket was propped, disturbingly neatly, against the wall beside him. "You," Vec clicked at him through the collar. "On your knees, hands on your head." Roy opened his eyes. He looked at Vec. He looked at the 3 guards behind Vec. "Sure thing, Chief," he said. He got to his knees. He put his hands on his head. He waited. Vec, satisfied, gestured the diamond formation forward. Restraints were produced. The bracket was noted. The borehead was inspected. Everything was, in principle, under control. That was when Roy said, "Y'all should probably know about the loop." Vec's mandibles flared. Silence. "Sure, Chief. I'm just saying the loop's got about 90 seconds left in it. See how the pressure's climbing on that gauge?" Every one of the 4 guards, involuntarily, glanced at the pressure gauge on the exhaust rail. It was, in fact, climbing. Roy stood up. Not fast, not aggressive, just up. He said, "You want to run, or you want to stand here and think about it?" The bracket that Roy had propped against the wall was, it turned out, the exact right shape and mass to slide, with a nudge of his heel, across the pressure junction of the self-cooling loop, breaking the seal and venting an 11 cubic meter volume of superheated exhaust in one direction, which was, of course, exactly the direction the 4 guards were standing in. The vent screamed once, high and clean. Sergeant Vech, whose reflexes were legitimately excellent, made it to the pressure door. The 3 others did not. Roy walked past the 3 cooked Vrethkai without looking at them. He was already moving toward the ventilation shaft at the low end of the room. He had at this point been in Section Grain for approximately 3 hours and 51 minutes. He said, mostly to himself, "Sorry, fellas." By the time Overseer Thresh's second monitor relay chimed, Roy Beckett was in the ventilation shaft, and Sergeant Vec was in the corridor outside Section Grain, trying to explain to his own mandibles what had just happened. Thresh had, by then, received the Earth Liaison dossier. The first fragment arrived on his data slate at the end of Hour 3, and it had been transmitted, at the Vrethkai Liaison Office's insistence, in 3 separate installments, because whoever had compiled it in the Earth Liaison Office had not been sure the file would be believed if it was sent in one piece. Thresh read it standing up. He preferred to read important documents standing up. It gave him the illusion of being braced. The dossier opened, as all Earth Liaison dossiers did, with the unhelpful boilerplate. Species, Terran. Gravity of origin, 1 standard, 98 1/100ths of a conclave reference unit. Estimated combat capacity, negligible, per treaty declarations from the Terran government, which the conclave, in its many councils, had never quite decided whether to believe. Then came the actual paperwork. Beckett, Roy Dennis. Male, 41 solar cycles. Origin, Harlan County, Kentucky, North American continent, Earth. Occupation, mine maintenance, thermal systems, grade 4, employed by the Meridian Deep Seam Extraction Corporation for 23 consecutive solar cycles. Physical assessment, within species norms. Height, 1 8/10 of a meter. Mass, 96 kilograms. Bone density, anomalous. See attached medical report. Attached medical report, Item 1. Subject's skeletal density measured at 41 solar cycles is 112% of species mean. Contributing factors: 4 decades of subterranean occupational exposure at depths averaging 400 meters below Terran surface level in conditions of chronic low-light stress and mild elevated CO2. Species standard adaptation. No augmentation. Thresh's mandibles clicked slowly. He had not known that a mammal could do that. Attached medical report, item 2. Subject demonstrates anomalous cardiovascular response to high-danger conditions. Specifically, subject's heart rate under threat of death conditions has been documented to decrease by an average of 11 beats per minute rather than increase. This response was flagged as a medical anomaly and cleared as non-pathological. No further investigation. Thresh read it twice. He read it a third time. His heart rate, he said aloud, slows down. Vesic, in the doorway, said nothing. Attached commendation, item 1. On the 5th day of the 4th solar month, subject's local calendar year 2011, subject participated in the recovery of 4 members of the Meridian Deep Seam Extraction Corporation from the collapse of secondary shaft 9. Subject navigated 1,200 meters of collapsed passage with only a hand auger, a foam canister, and a headlamp, whose battery failed at the 11-hour mark. Subject completed the recovery of all 4 members. Subject's own emergence occurred at the 31-hour mark, in total darkness, by touch. Subject was awarded the corporation's 3rd-tier Meritorious Service Medal, which he did not, on record, ever bother to pick up. Attached incident report, item 2. On the 22nd day of the 7th solar month, subject's local calendar year 2018, subject was one of 2 survivors of a full collapse of primary shaft 4. Subject spent 79 consecutive hours in a pocket of air, estimated at 3 cubic meters, with a fellow miner whose leg was broken and whose blood pressure required subject to maintain a manual tourniquet for the full duration. Subject reported no anxiety, and when asked by the corporation's psychological assessor at the debrief, described the 79 hours as, quote, kinda quiet, end quote. Thresh read the words, kinda quiet. He read them again. His mandibles opened wide, involuntarily. He was in the dark, he said, for 79 hours, with a dying man, and he described it as quiet. Vesic, in the doorway, made a low, uncomfortable sound. Overseer, there is a 3rd fragment. Thresh looked up. The 3rd fragment of the dossier, the fragment the Earth Liaison Office had, quite deliberately sent last, was a single line of text in the plain courier font the liaison used when it was frightened of the paperwork it had just filed. Cultural advisory, Terran occupational subspecies class minor, deep shaft. These subjects are non-combatants under Terran treaty declarations. They are, however, ill-suited for confinement in dark, hot, mechanically complex environments. It is the liaison's professional recommendation that these subjects, if acquired, be assigned strictly to surface-level agricultural or clerical duties. Under no circumstances should the subject be placed in a mine. Thresh, whose spine ran cold along its ventral seam for the 2nd time in a single hour, said very quietly, I have placed him in a mine. At which point the 3rd monitor relay from Section Grain chimed. By the end of hour 4, Roy Beckett had come up through the ventilation shaft at the low end of Section Green into the maintenance annex of Sub-Level 2, and Sub-Level 2 was where things began to break in earnest. The maintenance annex was where the camp's night crew came off shift. It was where the Vrethkai guards took their meals when they thought no one was watching, and where the low-caste Vrethkai technicians ran their small, unauthorized, unspeakably profitable side businesses in stolen ration bars and leaked payroll files. It was, in short, the exact place where a captive with a talent for observation could learn everything. Roy did not go into the annex. Roy sat in the ventilation shaft above the annex, 3 meters up, with his back against a cool metal wall, listening. He listened for 1 hour and 11 minutes. He did not move. He did not scratch. He did not blink more than a Vrethkai would consider natural. He listened to the low-caste technicians complaining about their pay. He listened to two off-shift guards discussing Sergeant Vake's disgrace, and more usefully, the location of Vake's backup pulse lance, which was apparently in the tool locker on the east wall. He listened to a female Vrethkai voice, one he had not heard before, ask another guard, in a hushed and hurried tone, whether the accounting annex had been polished for the inspector's rotation yet. The guard laughed quietly. Polished? Sure. Polished enough to fool a Veth. The female voice said, "The Veth are not fools, Grek." "The Veth," the guard said, "are patient. They will read our manifest. They will note the 2 Terran mortality lines. They will note that they were listed as thermal exposure and not medical experimentation, and they will pay us all a pretty compliment, and then they will get back on their ship and go home." The female voice said, "Both of them are still alive, Grek." There was a small, thick silence. The guard said, "Do not say that." The female voice said, "They are still in Annex 6. They are still eating. He has not been in there for 8 rotations because he cannot bear to look at what he did. He has not stopped drinking since the inspector's tour was announced. If Velsane finds Annex 6, we all—" The guard hissed. "Quiet." The female voice was quiet. Above them, in the ventilation shaft, Roy Beckett filed the words Annex 6 and still alive and medical experimentation into a mental drawer where he kept the sort of information that changed a job. He waited until the female voice and the guard had both gone. Then he moved. He came down out of the ventilation shaft into the maintenance annex. He took a spare set of low-caste technician coveralls off a hook. He took a maintenance data slate off a table. He took, because it was there, and because he had a use for it, a length of tungsten carbide drill shaft from a rack, 400 kilograms of conductive metal that no Vrethkai would ever expect a human to lift, and he dragged it, 1 careful centimeter at a time, along the polished floor into the corridor beyond. The drill shaft made a soft, whining scrape against the alloy. Roy walked with it as if it belonged to him. 2 low-caste technicians passed him in the corridor. They looked at the coveralls. They looked at the drill shaft. They looked at his face, which was, at that moment, the exact expression of a man who was doing exactly what he had been told to do. They looked away. Roy walked, dragging the tungsten carbide drill shaft behind him, like a very long, very unhurried tail, into the utility corridor that ran along the outer wall of sub-level 2. The utility corridor was a length of alloy tube 240 meters long, running parallel to the primary containment corridor of the camp. Along its outer wall, in the standard Vrethkai fashion, ran the emitter rail of the primary plasma lattice. The plasma lattice was the pride of Voreth 9. The plasma lattice was calibrated to disrupt the neural tissue of every single species listed in the Conclave's xenobiology register, which was, in effect, every species that had ever passed through a Conclave-registered slavers' camp. It ran on a modulation frequency that made Varian gill plates seize, made Pethmaran nervous systems fire uncontrollably, made Gal nomads collapse into a coma-like state within seconds, and made even the smaller Vrethkai castes go weak in the mandibles. The plasma lattice was the reason Voreth 9 had never had an escape. The plasma lattice, along with every plasma lattice ever produced in the Conclave, was completely, ridiculously vulnerable to a piece of raw metal on a stick. Roy dragged the tungsten carbide drill shaft along the emitter rail. The plasma lattice lit the corridor white. It grounded through the drill shaft into the alloy floor and out into the substructure of the camp, where it did nothing more dramatic than warm a large volume of already warm rock by 3 degrees. The corridor filled with the smell of hot metal. The drill shaft glowed a soft, sunset orange in Roy's hands. Roy's left forearm blistered clean through the coverall sleeve. He did not stop. He kept walking, and he kept dragging the drill shaft, and the plasma lattice, which was designed to disrupt neural tissue and not to survive being shorted to ground, popped, 1 emitter at a time, along the 240 meters of the utility corridor until, at the far end of the corridor, the primary containment corridor of Extraction Camp Vorith 9 became, for the first time in 3 solar cycles, an unmonitored, unlit, unpressurized, and unguarded stretch of hallway. Roy dropped the drill shaft at the end of the corridor. It clanged softly. He looked at his forearm. The skin was bright, wet, and beginning to hurt in earnest. He said quietly, "Well, that's gonna need a hand towel." He kept walking. By the end of hour 5, Overseer Thresh had abandoned the pulpit room and was standing on the command deck. His mandibles were open and would not, no matter how he tried, close. His ceremonial mantle hung askew from one shoulder. The Vesic second was in a corner, quivering. The primary plasma lattice was, according to the deck's readout, offline, along 240 consecutive meters of utility corridor. The primary containment corridor was, according to the same readout, dark. Section Grain was empty. 3 of Vake's 4 guards were in the medical annex, alive but no longer useful. Vake himself was in the corridor outside Section Grain, sitting on the floor, apologizing to his own ancestors. The human was in the camp. Somewhere, Thresh, whose species did not sweat, was, for the first time in his adult life, uncomfortably aware of the humidity in his own throat sac. "Send," he clicked, and stopped, and clicked again. "Send my personal retainers, all of them, now." Vesic lifted his mandibles. "Overseer, your personal retainers are outside the standard camp roster. They are not on the manifest. If Velsane's inspection—" "Send them," Thresh snapped, "or I will hang you from the pulpit myself and let the Gal Nomad watch." Vesic went. Thresh stood alone on the command deck. He turned to the readout. He watched a small, patient icon move, slowly, along a corridor 2 floors below his own feet, in the direction of a door which the manifest did not, officially, admit was there. The door was labeled, in the internal camp records, Annex 6. Thresh's mandibles, at long last, closed. He said softly, "No." He hit the manual override on the corridor 2 floors below. He tried to shut the door of Annex 6. The readout said the door of Annex 6 was already open. The readout said the human was inside. The readout said there were 2 other life signs in Annex 6. Human, alive, Terran standard vitals. Both of them. Thresh sat down, slowly, on the throne of a chair on his command deck. He put his mandibles in his own hands. Annex 6 was, as the female voice in the maintenance annex had said, still in use. Ted Vanek was 36 years old from Wichita, and he had been an intake at Vorith 9, 1 solar cycle and 1 month before. His manifest listed him as expired thermal exposure. His body had never been produced. His family on Earth had received a Vrethkai condolence chit and a shipping refund. He had, in fact, spent 11 months in Annex 6, on a hard cot, being fed exactly enough calories to remain alive, but not enough to be strong, while Thresh's private medical staff, a low-caste Vrethkai physician named Ket, and a Peth Maran with a chemistry license, ran their small, quiet trials on his neurology. The trials had not, thus far, produced any usable data. They had, however, produced a small mountain of paperwork. Thresh had been slowly, patiently forging into the manifest that Ovarch Velsen's inspection tour would find polished and adequate. Lena Cruz was 29 from Baton Rouge, and she had been in Annex 6 for 9 months. Her manifest also listed her as expired thermal exposure. Her file likewise had been closed. 2 intake fees collected, 2 death certificates forged. 2 humans still, technically alive on a camp that officially did not have them. The math was not complicated. It had produced over 1 solar cycle, a shell account in the Veth commercial registry that Thresh had told himself was his retirement. He had, in truth, forgotten it was cruel. It had become numbers. When Roy Beckett walked into Annex 6 at hour 5 and 41 minutes, wearing stolen technician coveralls and holding a maintenance data slate. Ted Vanek was on his cot, staring at the ceiling. Lena Cruz was sitting up, cross-legged, reading a conclave technical journal she had, through patient annoyance, convinced her guard to leave with her. They looked up at Roy. Roy looked at them. Roy said, "Hey." Ted said in the voice of a man who had not been surprised by anything in 11 months, "Hey." Lena more sharply said, "Who are you?" Roy said, "Beckett, Kentucky, Boiler Tech." "You are?" "Cruz," Lena said. "Baton Rouge, Comms Tech, Offshore Rig." "Vanek," Ted said. "Wichita, Long-Haul Trucker." Roy nodded slowly. "You two been in here how long?" Lena said, 9 months near as I can figure. He's been here longer." 11, Ted said, still looking at the ceiling. Roy looked around the room. 2 cots, a privy, a ration dispenser, a single Vrethkai medical monitor unmanned, a door that had, until his arrival, been sealed. Roy said quietly, "Y'all want to leave?" There was a small, complete silence in Annex 6. Lena Cruz's face did something that was almost a smile. She said, "Mr. Beckett, what is your plan?" Roy said, "I ain't got a plan yet. I got a map." "That's not a plan," Lena said. "No, ma'am," Roy agreed. "It ain't. But it beats no map." Ted from the cot said, "There's an inspector coming, Veth, 4 days out." Roy said, "I heard about that." Ted said, "Overseer's been polishing the manifest. Reason we're still alive, he ain't ready for the Veth to find us. Reason we're still in here, he ain't decided yet how to make us not alive without leaving anything for the Veth to find." Roy said, "How do you know?" Ted said, "Ket talks. That's the physician. Talks to himself when he thinks we're asleep. He's been drinking." Roy sat down slowly on the edge of Ted's cot. He looked at his own left forearm, which was by now blistered white and beginning to weep. He looked at Ted. He looked at Lena. He said, "Well, that changes the map." At hour 6, the camp entered a quiet phase that Overseer Thresh, watching the readouts on his command deck, did not know how to interpret. The human was in Annex 6. He had been in Annex 6 for the better part of an hour. The 2 life signs inside Annex 6 had not moved. No door had been forced. No plasma had been discharged. No alarm had sounded. The human was, according to the internal atmospheric monitors, sitting again. Thresh clicked at the readout. "Do something," he said. "Do something so I can shoot you." The readout declined to do something. Vesic from the corner said, "Overseer, your personal retainers are ready. There are 6 of them. They are waiting in the corridor outside your quarters." Thresh looked at the readout. The human was still not moving. Thresh said, "Deploy them to the corridor outside Annex 6. Full weapons, full authority. I want him alive." "Alive, Overseer. Alive," Thresh said. And then, because he could not stop himself, "I want to know how he does it." Vesic went. Thresh, alone on the command deck, watched the human's life sign in Annex 6. He was, for the first time in his career as an overseer, curious. It would prove, in retrospect, to have been the most expensive curiosity of his life. Roy spent the sitting hour in Annex 6 doing 3 things. He spent the first 20 minutes examining Ted's ration dispenser. It ran on a low-cost Vrethkai maintenance protocol he had, thanks to the maintenance data slate he had lifted from the annex, in his back pocket. He rewrote the dispenser's protocol so that it would, on his command, dump the entirety of its rationed calorie load into a single stream, which he collected in the spare medical basin that Ket, the drunken physician, had left in the corner. Ted watched him do it with the placid gaze of a man for whom nothing was surprising anymore. Lena watched him do it with the sharp, focused attention of a comms tech identifying a new signal. Roy said over his shoulder, "Cruz, you worked comms." "Rig comms," Lena said, "not Vrethkai. They ain't that different. Signal is signal. You look at this collar for me." He turned his head, exposing the intake collar around his neck. Lena, who had been looking at her own collar for 9 months, said, "Beckett, that's a Vrethkai command collar." "I know. I can't hack it." "You can trace it," Roy said. "You can tell me what frequency it's using." Lena's face did the something almost a smile again. She stood up. She came around to the back of Roy's neck. She looked for a long moment at the collar. She said, "Give me 2 hours." "You got one," Roy said. "I'll take one," Lena said. While Lena traced the frequency of the command collar with the medical monitor's diagnostic reader and a length of hair she had, quietly, over the last 9 months, been unraveling from a blanket, Roy did the second thing. He walked to the door of Annex 6. He stood in front of it. He put his ear against it. He listened. He said, quietly, 6 of them. Ted, from the cot, said, "Personal retainers, not camp guards. He'll send his personal retainers if he's scared." Roy said, "He's scared." Ted said, "Good." Roy stood at the door of Annex 6 for a long minute. He looked out of habit at his own left forearm. The blistering had spread, and the burn was beginning to speak to him now, in the way a burn does when it stops being an emergency and starts being a job. He rolled up the sleeve. He looked at the wound. He walked to Ket's medical shelf. He found a suture cauterizer. He clicked it on. He tested it on the inside of his wrist. He winced softly and clicked the setting up a notch. Lena, from the medical monitor, said, "Beckett." Roy said, "Yes, Mom." She said, "Are you about to do what I think you're about to do?" Roy said, "Yes, Mom." Lena said, "You are not going to anesthetize." Roy said, "There ain't time." Ted, from the cot, said, "Beckett." Roy said, "Fill it up, brother." He put the cauterizer to his own forearm. The Vrethkai medical monitor, which had been calibrated to Vrethkai pain response, registered the cauterization event as a minor procedural discomfort. Roy's face went pale, his jaw locked, his breath came out through his teeth in a low, thin whistle. The room smelled of burned meat. His left hand shook once, in a way it had not shaken since he was 17 years old, and then it stopped shaking. He said softly, "That's the boy." Lena Cruz, who had, in 9 months in Annex 6, seen very little that surprised her, went very quiet at the medical monitor and, without looking up, said, "Mr. Beckett, you are a difficult man." Roy said, "Not really. I just don't want to bleed on the collar." Lena quietly said, "It's a 219.4 frequency." Roy said, "Copy that." He did the third thing. He walked to the small, unmanned medical monitor. He plugged the maintenance data slate into it. He wrote, in the low-cast Vrethkai maintenance protocol, a program that took no more than 4 minutes to compose. He set the program to run on his own collar's return signal at frequency 219.4. He set the program to trigger on his mark on every Vrethkai collar in Extraction Camp Vorath 9 that was slave to his own network. Ted, from the cot, said, "What does the program do?" Roy said, "It says one word." "Which word?" Roy said, "Wait." Ted turned his head on the cot and for the first time in 11 months laughed. It was a broken, quiet laugh, but it was a laugh. He said, "You are going to say wait." "I am going to say wait," Roy agreed. Lena, from the medical monitor, said, "Beckett, those collars enforce compliance on Vrethkai as much as on us. If you send an override on frequency 219.4 to their collars, they will," Roy said. "Wait." Lena's face did the something, almost a smile, a third time. She said, "That is a mean plan." Roy said, "It's the only plan I've got that don't get us all shot." He walked to the door of Annex 6. He put his hand on the release. He said, over his shoulder, "Y'all stay put." He opened the door. The corridor outside Annex 6 was a straight length of alloy hall, 20 meters long, and at the far end of it stood 6 of Overseer Thresh's personal retainers. They were bigger than the camp guards. Their armor was better. Their weapons were the sort of thing that did not have Vrethkai standard issue markings on them. and were, in fact, of a make Roy did not recognize. They were, however, wearing collars. Roy stepped into the corridor. The retainer in the middle, a tall Vrethkai with a scarred mandible and a plasma lance of a make and grade Roy had never seen before, raised the weapon and pointed it at Roy's chest. Roy said quietly, "You want to think about that first shot, brother." The retainer clicked his mandibles. Roy pressed the send key on the maintenance data slate in his back pocket through the fabric. Every collar in the corridor said, in Roy Beckett's own drawled Kentucky accent, one word: wait. The Vrethkai command collar, of the sort each of the 6 retainers wore, was designed to enforce compliance under any and all conditions. It was calibrated to override the wearer's voluntary motor control on any authorized command from any authorized master frequency. Roy had, thanks to Lena, an authorized master frequency. Every single one of the 6 retainers froze. Roy walked unhurried down the corridor. He walked past the first retainer. He plucked the plasma lance from the retainer's frozen hands and set it carefully on the floor. He walked past the second retainer. He took that one's weapon too. He walked past the third, the fourth, and the fifth. 6 weapons, 6 frozen Vrethkai, standing in the corridor like a row of expensive statues, none of them able to blink, most of them still trying, through the collar override, to raise the 16th of a millimeter of mandible that would have been the beginning of a scream. At the 6th retainer, the one at the end of the corridor, the tall one with the scarred mandible, Roy stopped. He said, "Sarge?" The retainer's mandibles quivered very slightly. He said through the collar, "You are?" Roy said, "Roy Beckett, Boiler Tech. You?" The retainer said, "Grek, Master of Retainers." Roy said, "Grek, real nice to meet you." And he took Grek's plasma lance from his frozen hands and set it on the floor with the others. And then, because he had not, in a very long time, been in a good mood, he said quietly, "That command collar of yours, is it the same model as your overseer's?" Grek's mandibles quivered again. He said through the collar, "Yes." Roy said, "Well, that is real convenient." At hour 7, Overseer Thresh received a report on the command deck that would later be the point in the log at which he stopped being an overseer. The report was from the retainer named Grek, and it came through his own command collar, in his own voice, and it said, in the clipped Vrethkai clicks that Grek had used for 30 years, "Overseer, the human is escorting the 2 Terran subjects from Annex 6 to the maintenance annex. He requests your presence at the command deck. He says he will not be long." Thresh, on the command deck, stood up so fast that his ceremonial mantle fell off his shoulder entirely. "He requests," Thresh said, "my presence." "Yes, Overseer." "You," Thresh clicked at the collar, "are Grek, Master of my Retainers, and you are relaying to me on my own command channel a request from a boiler technician." "Yes, Overseer." "Grek," Thresh said. "How?" Grek's collar was silent for a moment. Then, through the collar, in Grek's own voice, it said, "He said the word wait, Overseer, on our frequency, and we waited." Thresh's mandibles moved through a full sequence of Vrethkai emotional expression in perhaps 2 seconds. Astonishment, fury, fear, and at the very end, a small, sharp, cold curiosity that Thresh, in retrospect, would identify as the exact moment when he began at last to admire the human. He said quietly, "I would like to see him." "He is coming, Overseer." "How long?" "He estimates 20 minutes, Overseer." Thresh sat down slowly on the throne of his chair. He said, "Vesic." Vesic in the corner quivered. "Overseer." Thresh said, "Bring me my ceremonial water." Vesic said, "Overseer, we are." Thresh said, "Bring it." Vesic brought it. Between Annex 6 and the command deck, Roy Beckett almost died. The corridor between the two was 6 wall thicknesses of camp architecture, and, at the 7th wall thickness, someone had, without announcing it to anyone, including Overseer Thresh, installed a manual fire pulse lance emplacement on the ceiling of the corridor junction. The pulse lance emplacement had been installed by a low-caste Vrethkai technician on the personal order of Vesik, the nervous second, exactly one solar cycle prior, on the theory that a pulse lance emplacement in an inconspicuous ceiling was a very good way to end a very bad conversation with a very ambitious rival if one was ever caught in the corridor. Vesik had, in his panic on the command deck, forgotten to mention the emplacement to Overseer Thresh. Roy walked into the corridor junction with Ted Vanek on his left and Lena Cruz on his right. He said quietly, "Down." He said it in the same slow, thick voice he had used in Section Grain, and Ted and Lena, both of whom had, in their brief acquaintance with Roy Beckett, learned to trust that voice, went down. The pulse lance fired. Roy did not entirely make it down. The lance's discharge caught him across the right side, from armpit to hip, and every one of his intercostal muscles seized at once. His right lung, or whatever fraction of it the lance had made unwilling, refused to inflate. His right side became, in the space of a single beat, a wall of pain, shaped like a man. He hit the floor on the left side of his body, which was, in retrospect, extremely lucky. His left forearm, which was the burned one, screamed once and went quiet. The pulse lance cycled. It was going to fire again. Roy's right hand was not working. Roy's left hand was. He rolled onto his back. He looked up at the ceiling. He saw the emplacement. He said in the slow, thick voice, "Sorry, Chief." He reached up with his left hand. He grabbed the emplacement's power conduit at the join. He pulled. The Vrethkai low-caste technician who had installed the emplacement had cut, to save money, on the conduit's fastenings. The conduit came out in Roy's hand. The emplacement powered down. Roy Beckett lay on his back on the floor of the corridor junction, his right side a screaming wall, his left forearm a slow, deep, wet burn. And he did, at that moment, the thing his medical file said he did under threat of death conditions. His heart rate dropped by 11 beats per minute. He said, "Cruz?" Lena, from the floor beside him, said, "Beckett." He said, "Count my heartbeats for me, ma'am. I gotta know if I need to sit up." Lena reached over quietly and put her fingers to his neck. She said after a moment, "Beckett, your heart is beating slow." Roy said, "That's normal." Lena said, "For a human?" Roy said, "For me." He turned his head. He looked at the corridor junction. He looked at the pressure vent at the far end. He said, "Cruz, Vanek, look at that vent." Ted, who had scrambled up onto his knees and was looking at that moment extremely alive, said, "Yeah?" Roy said, "That vent runs to the command deck's atmospheric plant. Command deck's pressure is calibrated for Vrethkai homeworld. That means the pressure differential from the corridor is—" He broke off, coughing, and the cough was bad, big. "Anybody standing in the command deck when that vent opens is going to lose fine motor control real fast." Ted said, "How fast?" Roy said, 40 seconds. Lena said, "How do you know?" Roy said, "I've done it before, sort of." Ted said, "In a mine." Roy said, "In a mine." He tried to sit up. His right side declined. He said quietly to his own body, "Come on, brother." His body did not. Lena said, "Beckett, I will vent the corridor." Roy said, "You can't rig the vent." Lena said, "I will vent the corridor, Mr. Beckett. You will lie there until you can stand up. Mr. Vanek will help me. Together, in 1.5 hours my time, we have destroyed a solar cycle of Vrethkai infrastructure. In the next 20 minutes, we will vent one corridor. Lie down." Roy said, "Yes, ma'am." He lay down. Lena, who was a comms tech from Baton Rouge, and had, in her 9 months in Annex 6, spent a great deal of unstructured time thinking about the exact composition of Vrethkai atmospheric plants, and how she would, if she had the chance, sabotage one, walk to the vent at the far end of the corridor junction and, with Ted Vanek's help and a length of conduit ripped from the ruined pulse lance emplacement, rigged it exactly the way Roy Beckett would have. She looked over her shoulder once at Roy on the floor. He was still there. He was breathing. He was looking at the ceiling. He was, she realized, thinking of something else. He was thinking of his sister. His sister's name was Kate. She lived, at the time of Roy's disappearance, in a small green apartment in Anchorage, Alaska, 3 floors above a bakery that made a serviceable rye bread and a very bad attempt at pumpernickel. She had, over the 23 years Roy had worked at the Meridian Deep Sea Extraction Corporation, sent him 1 letter a month, which he had, over the 23 years, answered 1 for 1, in a slow, careful hand that got worse as he got older and his fingers got harder. The letter he had been in the middle of writing when the shipping agent had picked him up was on the small table in his rented room in Kentucky. It said, "So far, 3 lines. Kate, weather's been mean this month, roof's holding though. I got." And then he had run out of things he had, and he had put the pen down, and he had gone out to the mailbox, and the shipping agent had put a hood over his head, and he had woken up in a Vrethkai cargo hold. He had not, in the intervening weeks, stopped thinking about that letter. He had not, in the intervening weeks, decided what he was going to tell her he had. He decided, on the floor of the corridor junction of Extraction Camp Vorath 9, that he had, in the end, one thing. He had a job. He said quietly to the ceiling, "Come on, sit up, you got work." He sat up. His right side screamed. His intercostals, which had on the pulse lance discharge promised him that they would not work for a week, discovered that they would work now, because Roy Beckett had informed them of the change in schedule. He got to his feet. He said softly, "Cruz, how long on the vent?" Lena, at the vent, said, 60 seconds. Roy said, "Give me 90. He walked, slow and thick and patient, toward the command deck. On the command deck, Overseer Thresh was drinking his ceremonial water in the small, careful sips of a Vrethkai, who has been thinking for the last 20 minutes about a boiler technician. He had, in that 20 minutes, arrived at a decision. The decision was that he did not know, actually, what he was going to do when the human walked through the pressure door. He had thought about firing. He had thought about begging. He had thought about the possibility, faintly ridiculous, that he might, on the arrival of the human, make an offer. Employment, a partnership, a very substantial share of the shell account in the Veth Commercial Registry. He had briefly considered fleeing, but Vrethkai overseers did not historically flee. He was still deciding when the pressure door of the command deck slid open. Roy Beckett walked in. His coveralls were burned on the left forearm and torn on the right side. His right arm hung a little wrong. His left hand held a length of conduit he had ripped from a ceiling on the way. His face was the color of coal ash. He was walking a little slower than he had walked into Section Grain. He was still walking. Behind him, from the corridor, came a soft, wet hiss. Lena Cruz had opened the vent. The pressure differential between the corridor and the command deck was, indeed, sizable. The command deck's atmosphere, calibrated for Vrethkai homeworld, was denser and richer in the low oxygen mix a Vrethkai lung liked, and the corridor's atmosphere was, thanks to 9 months of Vesic-approved cost-cutting, thinner. The 2 atmospheres, at the moment Lena's vent opened, decided to have a conversation. The conversation was loud. Overseer Thresh's mandibles flapped once. He said, "What?" His mandibles flapped again. He said, "The what? Pressure." Vesic, from the corner, said something that translated through the collar as an untranslatable Vrethkai expletive. 6 of Thresh's personal retainers, who had, in the last 10 minutes, been unfrozen by an act of clemency Roy Beckett would later describe as, "I couldn't just leave 'em there," and had been quietly walking behind Roy in a line as escorts, walked in through the pressure door. Their command collars, having been reset to Roy's frequency by Lena Cruz's hairline trace and the maintenance data slate, said, softly in Roy's voice, 1 word, "Sit." The 6 retainers sat down. Vesic, whose command collar had also been reset, sat down, Overseer Thresh, whose command collar was the master of the network and was, in principle, immune to the network's override, remained standing, but his mandibles were beginning to lose their fine motor control from the pressure differential, and his ceremonial water was spilling. Roy said quietly, "Overseer." Thresh looked at him. Roy said, "You promised the room back at intake that I was going to be on my knees in section green by dawn, asking for my mother." Thresh's mandibles made a small involuntary click. Roy said, "It ain't dawn yet." Thresh said, "It is not." Roy said, "So we still got time. You want to talk or you want to sit down?" Thresh, whose mandibles were, at this point, losing fine motor control in earnest, sat down. Roy walked past him. Roy walked to the command deck's chair. Roy sat down in it slowly, so his right side would not scream. He said, "Grek!" Grek, at the pressure door, said, "Beckett." Roy said, "Would you close that vent for me, Chief? I don't want the overseer to pass out on me." Grek closed the vent. The pressure differential in the command deck equalized. Thresh's mandibles regained fine motor control. He looked very slowly at the boiler technician sitting in his chair. Roy said, "So, Overseer, let's have a conversation about Annex 6. At hour 8 and 41 minutes, the conversation on the command deck of Extraction Camp Vorath 9 was the strangest one that command deck had ever held. Overseer Thresh, no longer in his ceremonial mantle, told Roy Beckett, in the small, quiet clicks of a Vrethkai who has decided to save his own life by cooperating, the full architecture of the kickback scheme. 2 intake fees collected, 2 death certificates forged, 1 shell account in the Veth commercial registry held under a name Thresh had chosen from a list of extinct Vrethkai royalty. Payments made to a low-caste Vrethkai physician named Ket and a Peth Moran chemistry technician for their trials. Payments made to a shipping agent on Earth for the specific procurement of humans marked as expendable. Payments made, in fact, to the shipping agent who had, 23 days prior, picked Roy Beckett up outside his rented room in Harlan County, Kentucky. Roy's face, when he heard the name of the shipping agent, did not change. He said quietly, "Say the name again." Thresh said the name again. Roy nodded once. He filed the name as he had filed Annex 6 in the drawer at the back of his mind where he kept the sort of information that changed a job. He said, "How long till the inspector docks?" Thresh said, 3 rotations. Roy said, "Change of plans. He's docking in 4 hours." Thresh's mandibles flapped. "What?" Roy said, "Cruise." Lena, at the command deck's comms panel, into which she had, in the last 5 minutes, been quietly reading her way, said, "Beckett." Roy said, "You got a comms channel to the Veth?" Lena said, "I do." Roy said, "Ask Inspector Ovarch Velsen to come on over. Tell him there's been a scheduling change. Tell him it's about Annex 6. Lena, whose face did the something almost a smile a 4th time, said, "Yes, Mr. Beckett." Ted Vanek, from the pressure door, where he was leaning on the frame in the manner of a man for whom nothing was surprising anymore, said quietly, "Beckett, you got any coffee on this deck?" Roy looked, for the first time since he had sat down in the command chair, tired. He looked at the small table beside the chair. On it was a small Vrethkai flask of what the intake documents insisted was coffee. He picked it up. He took a sip. He said, "Vanek, this is not coffee." Vanek said, "Then no, there is no coffee on this deck." Roy set the flask down. He said softly, "Well, that's a problem for afternoon." Overseer Thresh, from the floor, said, "Beckett, what are you doing?" Roy said, "I am running your camp, Overseer." "For how long?" Roy said. "Till the Veth get here." Inspector Ovarch Velsane's Veth cutter docked at Extraction Camp Vorath 9 at local noon. Local noon was, in the Vrethkai standard rotation, an unusual hour to dock. Ovarch Velsane's cutter had been scheduled for 4 rotations later. Ovarch Velsane had, when the Vrethkai command deck of Vorath 9 had, in a female human voice, requested he move his docking to now, done exactly 2 things. He had first checked the Veth commercial registry for any shell accounts belonging to Overseer Thresh of Extraction Camp Voreth 9, and had, in the check, found one. He had second called for his tea. He drank his tea in transit. He was by nature a patient administrator. When his cutter's ramp opened onto the intake dock of Voreth 9, he stepped out flanked by 4 Veth adjutants in the plain grey robes of the Conclave's inspectorate. He walked unhurried into the pulpit room. He walked unhurried up the stairs. He was met at the top of the stairs by 6 of Overseer Thresh's personal retainers, who were, at that moment, sitting in a line on the floor, because the command collar around each of their necks was telling them, in a soft Kentucky drawl, to sit. Ovarch Velsane's plate-like face did not change. He walked past the retainers. He walked onto the command deck. He found on the command deck 3 humans. One was sitting in the overseer's chair, with his right arm hanging a little wrong, and his left forearm bandaged with strips of a torn Vrethkai coverall. One was leaning against the pressure door, looking at the Veth, with the mild interest of a long-haul trucker looking at a state trooper. One was at the comms panel, standing with her arms folded, holding herself very still in the manner of a comms tech, who had, in the last 3 hours, done a great deal of very good work she was not yet willing to show off. And on the floor of the command deck, in a small, dispirited pile, was Overseer Thresh. Ovarch Velsane stood in the middle of the command deck and looked at the 3 humans and the pile of Overseer Thresh. He said in the deep, polite Veth clicks that his own translation collar rendered as the mildest possible interrogative, "Explain." Roy Beckett stood up, slowly, from the command chair. He said, "Inspector." Ovarch Velsane said, "Yes." Roy said, "My name is Roy Beckett. I am a boiler technician from Harlan County, Kentucky on Earth. My colleagues are Lena Cruz, comms from Baton Rouge, and Ted Vanek, long haul from Wichita. We are 3 of 219 humans purchased on private consignment by Overseer Thresh of this camp for use as intake in the last 2 solar cycles. 2 of us have been listed on this camp's mortality roll as expired thermal exposure. We have not, however, expired. We have been held in an undocumented annex of Sublevel 2, designated Annex 6, and have been subject to unsanctioned medical trials by a Vrethkai physician of the name Ket and a Peth Moran chemistry technician whose name, sir, I don't have." He drew a breath, carefully. Overseer Thresh has forged the death certificates in question. He has, in the same period, established a shell account in the Veth commercial registry, into which he has diverted 217 unrecorded intake fees, the accounting of which is on his personal data slate, in his second Vesix data slate, and in 3 redundant backups I have found on the command deck. The shell account, sir, is listed under the extinct royal name Vrech Karach, and I believe you will find the account was accessed as recently as this morning. Ovarch Velsane's plate-like face did not change. He said, in the same polite Veth clicks, "How long, Mr. Beckett, have you been in this camp?" Roy said, 9 hours and 12 minutes, sir." There was a very long silence in the command deck. Ovarch Velsane walked unhurried across the deck. He stopped in front of Roy Beckett. He looked up at him, because he was smaller than Roy Beckett by 2 heads, and he said softly, "Mr. Beckett, would you consent, on behalf of the Conclave Inspectorate, to a formal statement?" Roy said, "Yes, sir, I would." Ovarch Velsane said, "And what would the Conclave Inspectorate be permitted to offer you, Mr. Beckett, in recognition of the operational condition in which we find this camp?" Roy Beckett, who had at that moment been standing for 2 full hours since the pulse lance discharge, and had, at the very back of his mind, been thinking about coffee, held up the small Vrethkai flask of intake ration coffee that Ted Vanek had, 20 minutes prior, put in his hand as a joke. He said, "Real coffee, sir, if you have some, not this." Ovarch Velsane looked at the flask. He said, "That is not coffee, Mr. Beckett." Roy said, "No, sir, it is not. HFY Sci said, "It will be arranged," Roy said. "And sir, there's a CO2 buildup in section green. Whole thermal exhaust in that section is running on a single line, and any species with a lung is going to be on the floor inside 20 minutes if you don't split it. I've written up the fix. I've got a punch list, sir, for the whole camp. It's on the data slate. It'll take your engineers about 4 days if you rush. 6 if you don't." HFY Sci's plate-like face did the smallest possible thing that was almost a smile. He said, "Mr. Beckett, would you take a commission with the Conclave Inspectorate as an operational consultant? Terms to be negotiated. Pay in Conclave standard. Transfer to any bank on Earth of your preference." Roy said, "Sir, that's a real kind offer, and I appreciate it. And after this morning, I'm going to need a job on account of my old one being with an outfit whose shipping agent turns out to have been in the business of selling boiler techs to the Vrethkai for a fee. We're aware of the shipping agent, Mr. Beckett." "Yes, sir. Figured you would be." "Then," Roy said, "then I would take that commission, Inspector, on one condition." "Name it." "My sister lives in Anchorage. Green apartment, above a bakery. Her name's Kate. She's had a letter from me on the way for 23 days that ain't gonna arrive, and she thinks I'm dead. I need a message to get to her before the sun goes down on Alaska today, sir, in my own voice, saying I am not dead, saying I got a new job, saying I will explain when I get home." HFY Sci said softly, "It will be arranged, Mr. Beckett, within the hour." Roy said, "Then we got a deal, Inspector." He put out his left hand because his right was still not working. HFY Sci, whose species did not shake hands, considered the gesture for a moment, and then, with the small, careful diplomacy that had earned him his post, extended his own plated hand and shook it. At the pressure door, Ted Vanek, in the voice of a man for whom nothing was surprising anymore, said, "Beckett, you want me to arrest the overseer, or is that his job?" Roy said, "Inspector, Overseer Thresh is your problem now. I have zip-tied him to his own chair with a length of stripped conduit. There are 3 redundant backups of his accounting on this deck. The physician Ket is in the maintenance annex, drinking. Every collar in this camp is on my frequency. If you would like the master frequency turned over, sir, Ms. Cruz has been writing you a technical brief on it since the moment your cutter docked." HFY Sci said, "That would be helpful, Mr. Beckett." Lena Cruz at the comms panel said, "Beckett, you want me to go ahead?" Roy said, "Cruz, go ahead." Lena, whose face did the something almost a smile a 5th time, hit the send. Every collar in Extraction Camp Voreth 9, from the Gal nomads on the intake dock to the sanded-down mandibles of the 2nd Vesic on the corner of the command deck, updated in a single quiet pulse to the frequency of the Veth Inspectorate. HFY Sci, whose plate-like face had, in the last 5 minutes, done the smallest possible almost smile a total of 3 times, permitted himself, for the first time in his career, the smallest possible actual one. He said, "Mr. Beckett, welcome to the Conclave." Overseer Thresh from the floor, in the small, quiet clicks of a Vrethkai who had understood at last that he had lost, said, "Beckett." Roy said, "Overseer." Thresh said, "I promised you would be on your knees in section grain by dawn." Roy said, "Yes, you did, Overseer." Thresh said, "How, Beckett?" Roy looked at him. He looked at the command deck. He looked at his own left forearm, which was, at that moment, a slow, patient burn under a strip of Vrethkai coverall. He looked at Ted Vanek at the pressure door and Lena Cruz at the comms panel, and past them at the pale grey Veth adjutants who were, at that moment, quietly taking custody of the retainers in the corridor. He said, softly, "Overseer, we ain't invincible. We bleed, we break, we die, we just make the other fella die faster." He paused. He said, "And the dark don't scare us any." He walked slowly past the pile of Overseer Thresh, and past the Veth Inspector, and past the 6 retainers now being escorted into the pulpit room by their new masters, and at the pressure door of the command deck he stopped and he looked over his shoulder one last time at the noon light coming through the observation window over Extraction Camp Vorith 9. He said quietly to HFY Sci, "Inspector, about that coffee." HFY Sci said, "Immediately, Mr. Beckett." Roy said, "Much obliged." He walked out. The Veth adjutants took the camp in the small, patient, undramatic way the Conclave Inspectorate took camps. Overseer Thresh was formally arrested at 14 minutes past local noon and would, in the fullness of the Conclave's slow legal machinery, spend the remainder of his natural life on a low-orbit penal habitat where the atmosphere was calibrated 1 full % thinner than his species preferred. Bessic, the nervous second, cooperated so thoroughly with the inspectorate that his own mandibles resharpened themselves in gratitude. Ket, the physician, was found in the maintenance annex holding a small bottle and weeping into his own carapace, and was collected without struggle. The Pethmaran chemistry technician, whose name Roy Beckett never did learn, attempted to flee down the ventilation shaft at the low end of Section Grain, and was, in a small, quiet irony, found 4 hours later in the exact self-cooling loop Roy had rigged that morning. 219 humans, including the 217 whose intake fees Overseer Thresh had forged and the 2 whose death certificates he had signed himself, were, in the course of the following week, identified, catalogued, medically examined and shipped on HFY Sci's personal signature to their nearest Terran consulate. The shipping agent in Harlan County, Kentucky, whose name Overseer Thresh had said on the command deck and whose name Roy Beckett had filed in the back of his mind, was arrested by the Conclave's Terran liaison office at 4 in the afternoon on the day Roy Beckett walked off the command deck. In the parking lot of a diner where the shipping agent had that morning ordered a plate of biscuits and gravy and a cup of what the diner insisted was coffee. Roy Beckett, in the small guest quarters of HFY Sci's cutter, dictated a 2-minute message to his sister Kate on the green apartment in Anchorage. The message arrived on her building manager's desk within the hour. It said in Roy's slow, careful voice that he was not dead, that he had a new job, that the weather had been mean this month, but the roof was holding, that he would explain when he got home, that he loved her. He signed off, at the end of the 2 minutes, in the same drawl he had used to hold 6 retainers in a corridor with a single word. He said, "You take care, sis. I'll see you soon." He fell asleep at last, at the small table of the guest quarters, with his right arm hanging a little wrong and his left forearm bandaged in proper Veth medical dressing, and, on the small table in front of him, a cup of real, actual brewed Terran coffee. He had, at the moment of falling asleep, been awake for exactly 26 hours. His heart rate, at the moment of falling asleep, was 61 beats per minute. The overseer had promised him he would break by dawn. He had run the camp by noon. What a journey. Here is the truth this story leaves us with. The deadliest weapon a human ever carries into the dark is not muscle or steel or a machine. It is the calm, patient refusal to be surprised. If this story moved you, hit that like button. It is the small, simple thing that keeps stories like this one alive on this channel. Share it with a friend who loves science fiction, where a quiet human walks into an impossible room and walks back out with the deed to the place. Subscribe and tap the little bell so the next big HFY epic finds you the moment it drops. And in the comments, tell me straight, if you were HFY Sci on that command deck at noon, would you have hired Roy Beckett as your operational consultant on the spot? Or would you have offered him a quiet ride home to Anchorage and let another human carry the badge? Choose one. Tell me why. Keep your eyes on the dark between the stars, friend, because something out there is always watching, and sometimes, once in a very great while, so are we.